There's a kind of loneliness that you built yourself, not because you wanted to be lonely, but because somewhere along the way you developed a set of habits, small, reasonable sounding, hard to argue with, that gradually put more and more distance between you and other people. You're too tired to make plans. You'll reply to that message later. You need the weekend to recharge before you can be social. You're just not someone who's good at keeping in touch. All of these things feel true in the moment, and none of them are the full story. Because underneath them, if you look honestly, is a pattern of creating just enough friction, just enough delay, just enough distance to make deep connection reliably difficult. And the painful part is that this pattern often runs alongside a genuine longing for connection. The person who never responds to messages might be the same person who lies awake wondering why they feel so alone. Today we're looking at 10 subtle habits of people who secretly isolate themselves. Habits that are so normalized, so individually defensible, that most people who have them don't recognize them as isolation at all. They just think they're introverted, or busy, or not a people person. Some of that may be true, and some of it may be something worth looking at a little more closely. Before we go further, a distinction worth making. Solitude and isolation are not the same thing. Solitude is chosen aloneness that restores. The introvert's weekend at home, the walk without headphones, the evening without obligation. It refills. It produces the person who is ready when the time comes to actually show up. Isolation is different. Isolation is the aloneness that compounds. That takes you further from the connections you actually want, not because you've genuinely rested and recharged, but because the distance itself has become the default. The mechanism rather than the choice. This video is not about introverts who need time alone. It is not a case against solitude or prescription for being more social. It is about a specific pattern, one that many people carry without fully recognizing, in which the habits that look like self-care or preference are actually creating a kind of distance that the person didn't consciously choose and doesn't entirely want. Let's look at what that pattern actually looks like. Habit 1. Always being too busy, but never actually catching up. The busyness is real. The to-do list is long, the obligations are genuine, and the exhaustion at the end of the day is not performed. But there's a specific quality to the busyness of someone who uses it to manage distance. It never resolves. Next week is always also going to be busy. The promised window of availability keeps moving forward on the calendar without ever arriving. On the surface, this looks like having a full life, like being productive, in demand, a person with many commitments. But if you look at the pattern over time, at whether the busyness ever converts into actual presence, whether "let's do something next month" ever becomes a specific plan, a different picture emerges. The busyness is not just a condition, it is also, at some level, a management strategy, a way of being technically open to connection while structurally unavailable for it. The question is not whether you are busy, the question is what the busyness is protecting you from. Because sometimes the answer is simply that life is full, and sometimes the answer is something more specific. The risk of showing up, of being known, of connection that goes deep enough to also be able to hurt. Habit 2. Giving vague answers to avoid making concrete plans. We should definitely catch up soon. Let's do something next month. I'll text you when things settle down. These are not lies. The intention is usually genuine, but they are also functionally non-answers, responses that maintain the warmth of connection without creating the conditions for it to actually happen. There is a specific social skill involved in this, the art of seeming available without being committal. It keeps the relationship warm. It signals care. It prevents the awkwardness of an explicit no. and it indefinitely postpones the vulnerability of an explicit yes. Because a concrete plan is a different thing from a vague future intention. A concrete plan has a date, a place, a commitment that creates accountability. It converts the relationship from potential into actual. And actual relationships are the ones that require showing up. The person who gives only vague answers has, whether they realize it or not, built a social life in which every relationship stays safely in the potential category. Close enough to feel warm, distant enough to stay manageable. The warmth is real. The distance is also real. And the vague answer is the mechanism that maintains both at once. Habit 3. Leaving messages on read. Then feeling guilty. Then leaving more on read. You see the message, you intend to reply, and then the moment passes and replying becomes slightly harder because now some time has gone by, and the reply has to account for the gap, and so you need more time and energy to respond than the message originally required, and so the gap grows. The messages pile up, each one slightly harder to respond to than the last, because the delay itself has become part of what needs to be addressed. This is one of the most common isolation habits in the digital age, and one of the most misunderstood. It is usually attributed to being bad at texting, or forgetful, or overwhelmed. But for many people, there's a specific quality to the messages that are most reliably left on read. They are from the people who want more connection than currently feels manageable. The messages that don't get answered are often not the ones from people you don't care about. They are sometimes from the people you care about most, whose connection you most want, and whose closeness you most need to manage carefully. The guilt is real, and the guilt doesn't lead to replying, because the guilt is not really about the message. It is about the distance you're maintaining, which you haven't yet decided to close. Habit 4. Being the initiator. So you can control when things end. You are often the one who makes the plan. You're organized, reliable, thoughtful about logistics, and you always seem to have a reason that the gathering needs to end at a particular time. This looks like being considerate, like being an excellent host or organizer, like someone who takes responsibility for making things happen. But there is a specific function in always being the initiator that is worth examining. When you control the beginning, you also control the end. And controlling the end means that the connection never goes deeper than the depth you've pre-approved. You can leave before it gets too intimate, before someone asks something you'd rather not answer, before the evening becomes something that requires more of you than you budgeted for. The need to manage the exit is a signal. It says, connection is something I want in controlled doses, and I don't fully trust what will happen if I let someone else determine when it's over. There is nothing wrong with having limits. But when the limits are always the same, and the control is always yours, the connections that result will always be exactly as deep as you've predetermined, and no deeper. Habit 5. Showing up, but never fully arriving. You went. You showed up. By any external measure, you were there, but you were also, simultaneously, not fully there. Part of your attention was elsewhere. On the mental list of what you need to do when you get home, on the time, on the conversation you're rehearsing for later, on the general background sense of wanting this to be over so you can return to the comfortable distance of your own space. Showing up without arriving is one of the more sophisticated forms of isolation, because it gives the appearance of connection without the substance of it. You attend. You participate minimally. You avoid the worst social guilt of not showing up at all. And you leave no more connected than when you arrived, because you never fully let the connection land. This is exhausting in a specific way. It costs the social energy of being present without returning the social benefit of actually connecting. The worst of both options. and it compounds over time. People sense the partial presence even when they can't name it, and the relationships stay at the surface because the surface is all that's consistently offered. Habit 6. Keeping relationships at exactly the depth you can manage. You're a good friend, a caring acquaintance, a pleasant colleague. You're warm, genuinely interested, reliable within the parameters of the relationship. And yet, if someone tried to go deeper, tried to share something more vulnerable, tried to move the relationship into more territory than it currently occupies, something in you would find a way to redirect. Not cruelly, not even consciously. Just, the conversation would move somewhere safer. The vulnerability would be received but not matched. The door would stay ajar rather than open. Every relationship has an implicit ceiling, installed and maintained by the person who needs the most distance. In this case, that person is you. And the ceiling is not about not caring. You care genuinely about many of the people in your life. It is about the specific fear of what happens in relationships that go deep enough to also carry real risk. The fear of being fully known and found insufficient. The fear of needing someone and having that need become a vulnerability. The fear of connection that has enough weight to also cause real pain if it's lost. The managed depth is a reasonable response to that fear. It is also, over time, a reason to feel vaguely alone in most rooms, surrounded by relationships that are real, but none of them quite reaching the place that loneliness actually lives. Habit 7. Canceling plans and feeling relief. Then loneliness. Then relief again. You cancel. And the immediate feeling is relief. The pressure lifts. The evening opens up. The introvert in you exhales. And then, somewhere in the middle of the evening that you'd freed up, something quieter arrives. Not quite loneliness, but adjacent to it. The sense that the freedom you bought was not quite as satisfying as you'd expected. That the connection you'd been avoiding was also something you'd been wanting. And the next time you have plans, you cancel those too. Because the relief is immediate and the loneliness comes later, and immediate always wins. This cycle is one of the clearest signatures of the ambivalence at the center of social isolation, the simultaneous genuine desire for connection and the genuine drive to avoid it. Both are real. Both run concurrently. And the behavior that results, approaching, retreating, relief, regret, repeat, is not inconsistency or irrationality. It is the very coherent behavior of someone who wants something and has very good reasons to also be afraid of it. The pattern will not change by trying harder to keep plans. It changes when the fear that generates the relief becomes visible enough to be worked with, rather than simply acted on. Habit 8. Being easier to reach online than in person. Online you are present, responsive sometimes, funny occasionally. Yourself more than people who only know your in-person version might expect. The screen provides a specific kind of safety, distance, time, the ability to compose yourself before responding, the ability to exit without consequence, the absence of the physical vulnerability that comes with being in the same room as someone. In-person conversation requires more. It requires being caught off guard, being read by someone who is watching your face rather than parsing your words, being in a space that is harder to leave and harder to manage. It requires presence that cannot be curated the way a text message can. For people who isolate, in-person connection often feels disproportionately costly compared to what it returns. The energy expenditure is real, and the return, the warmth, the connection, the sense of being known, is less certain than it would be for someone who doesn't spend the interaction managing the distance. The irony is that digital communication, however convenient, rarely reaches the places that genuine connection lives. And the longer the preference for screen-over presence persists, the harder in-person connection becomes. not because people's skills atrophy exactly, but because the tolerance for the vulnerability of actual presence continues to decrease. Habit 9. Describing yourself as bad at keeping in touch as a fixed trait. I'm just bad at keeping in touch. I'm terrible at texting back. That's just how I am with people. These statements function as explanations. They provide a narrative that makes the behavior make sense, both to the person saying them and to the people who might otherwise feel hurt by the distance. But there is something worth examining in how quickly they arrive, and how little they invite further inquiry. They are conclusions rather than investigations. They shut down the question of why by answering it with an identity. The person who says, "I'm just bad at keeping in touch," is rarely examining what they mean by that. Whether the badness is consistent across all relationships or specific to certain ones. Whether it arrived at some point or was always there. Whether it is genuinely a fixed trait or a pattern that made sense in a particular context and has not yet been reevaluated. The label "bad at keeping in touch" protects the isolation by making it invisible, by converting a behavior into a personality characteristic that feels inherent rather than chosen. And inherent things don't need to be examined, they just are. But almost nothing about how we connect with people is truly fixed, which means the label is doing something more active than it appears. Habit 10. Wanting more connection, while doing the things that make it harder. This is the one that sits beneath all the others. Most people who isolate themselves don't want to be isolated. They want connection, genuinely, sometimes acutely. They feel its absence. They notice when it's missing. They can be moved by its presence in other people's lives in a way that carries a particular ache, and yet the habits persist. The messages go unanswered. The plans get canceled. The relationships stay at the managed depth. The evenings pass in the comfortable distance of their own company. This is not hypocrisy. It is ambivalence. And ambivalence is not the same thing as confusion. The person in the middle of this pattern knows what they want. They also know, usually without being able to fully articulate it, what they're afraid of. And the fear is not irrational. Connection is genuinely risky. Being known is genuinely exposing. Needing people is genuinely uncomfortable for someone who has learned, through experience, that need creates vulnerability. The 10 habits on this list are not character flaws. They are a reasonably coherent defense system, built over time, probably for good reasons, against the specific risks that genuine closeness carries. The problem is not the defense. The problem is when the context has changed, when the people available now are not the people who made the original defense necessary, and the system keeps running anyway. Noticing this is not a small thing. Most people who isolate are not aware that they isolate. They experience it as the circumstances of their life, as being busy, as being introverted, as simply not having found the right people yet. If this video has put a different frame on some of those circumstances, if it has made some of the habits visible in a way they weren't before, that is already something. Because you cannot change what you cannot see. And seeing it clearly without judgment is the beginning of deciding whether you want it to continue. 10 habits, none of them dramatic, each of them individually defensible. Together, they form a pattern that creates a specific kind of distance. Not the distance of someone who doesn't want people, but the distance of someone who wants people and has built very effective systems for keeping them at a manageable remove. I want to be clear about something. Isolation is not a character flaw. It is a defense mechanism. And defense mechanisms don't develop because something is wrong with you. They develop because something needed defending. At some point, in some context, this distance served a real purpose. The question is not whether you should have built it. The question is whether the context has changed enough that you might want to revisit it. Because here is what isolation costs in the long run. Not just the specific connections you've kept at arm's length, but the capacity for the kind of connection that genuinely repairs. The relationships that go deep enough to carry real weight in the other direction, to provide the felt sense of being known and wanted, which is the only thing that actually addresses the loneliness that isolation both creates and protects against. The habits are not going to change overnight. Some of them have been running for a very long time, but noticing them, which you are now doing, at least partially, is the necessary first step. You cannot change the distance until you can see it clearly enough to know that you are the one creating it. If this video describes something familiar, consider sitting with it a little longer, not to fix it immediately, just to let the scene be real. Take care of yourself. We'll see you in the next one.